Picture this. You reach behind you, and the roll is empty. No backup under the sink. No corner store open. Just you, a bare cardboard tube, and a rising sense of panic. Genuinely uncomfortable, right? Here's the twist. For the overwhelming majority of human history, that panic wasn't a rare bad day. It was simply normal life, because toilet paper, in anything resembling its modern form, is a shockingly recent invention. Humanity spent tens of thousands of years solving this exact same problem using sponges, leaves, corn cobs, smooth pottery, snow, wool, and eventually, old newspapers, long before anyone thought to sell a soft paper roll specifically for this purpose. So let's go back, way back. Because some of these solutions are genuinely clever, some are genuinely rough, and at least one of them is going to make you deeply grateful for whatever's currently sitting in your bathroom cabinet. Start in ancient Rome, because this is the story that shocks almost everyone the first time they hear it. Roman public latrines were remarkably social spaces, long stone benches with a row of keyhole-shaped openings, where citizens would sit side by side, chatting, conducting business, essentially treating the bathroom as a communal gathering spot. And resting in a shallow trough of flowing water in front of that bench sat a tool called a tersorium, a natural sea sponge attached to the end of a stick. Here's the detail that genuinely stops people in their tracks. That sponge was shared. Rinse it in the running water, use it, pass it along, or in some cases, simply leave it in a communal bucket of salt water or vinegar between uses, ready for the next person sitting down the bench. Imagine sitting in a public bathroom, chatting with your neighbor, and then handing them the exact same sponge on a stick you just finished using yourself. To be fair to the Romans, there's some genuine historical debate about how strictly communal these sponges actually were in every context. Some wealthier citizens likely kept a private one for personal use. But the general practice of a shared sponge on a stick, rinsed in running water between uses, is well documented, and it remains one of the most consistently surprising facts people learn about the ancient world. Now let's head to ancient Greece, where the approach was considerably less soft, but honestly, more resourceful than you'd expect. Archaeologists have found smooth, curved pieces of broken pottery, called passoi, specifically shaped and sanded down for personal hygiene use. Broken pottery was everywhere in the ancient world, essentially free, endlessly available, and durable enough to be reused. Someone, at some point, realized that with a little smoothing, a broken piece of an old jug could be repurposed into a genuinely functional tool. Picture an ancient Greek household with a small basket of smooth pottery fragments kept specifically for this purpose, essentially recycling household waste into a daily necessity. Resourceful, certainly. Comfortable, almost certainly not. Let's jump forward into medieval Europe, because the methods here get considerably more variable, depending entirely on what happened to be growing nearby. Soft leaves, when available, were a genuinely common choice, along with moss, which has the added benefit of being naturally somewhat absorbent. Wool scraps, hay, and straw rounded out the options for households near farms, while wealthier families sometimes had access to soft linen or cloth scraps set aside specifically for this purpose. Here's an interesting detail worth pausing on. English monasteries actually built long communal privy buildings called reredouters, essentially a medieval version of the Roman public latrine, connected directly to the monastery's water supply for basic sanitation. Monks, it turns out, were often ahead of the general population when it came to organized plumbing, even if the actual cleaning materials available to them remained fairly rudimentary by modern standards. Now, let's shift to an entirely different approach, one that never actually involved paper at all, and remains genuinely common across huge portions of the world even today. Across much of the Middle East, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, water has long been, and continues to be, the primary method of personal hygiene, using a small vessel, sometimes called a loda, or simply a jug or dipper kept beside the bathroom, to rinse thoroughly with the left hand reserved specifically for this task. Here's the twist that surprises a lot of people raised in paper-based cultures. From a purely practical hygiene standpoint, water genuinely does a more thorough job of cleaning than dry paper alone. This is exactly why modern bidets, which we'll get to shortly, and handheld bidet sprayers remain standard bathroom fixtures across huge portions of the globe, even as toilet paper became the dominant method elsewhere. Billions of people today still primarily rely on water rather than paper, a detail that often gets completely overlooked in stories that focus mainly on Western hygiene history. Now here's where the actual invention of paper itself enters the story, and it happened far earlier and in a far different context than most people assume. Ancient China gets credit for inventing paper itself sometime around the 2nd century, and remarkably, some of the very earliest historical references to paper being used specifically for personal hygiene also come from China, documented as early as the 6th century. By the Tang dynasty, several centuries later, records describe the imperial court specifically requesting soft paper sheets, prepared and reserved exclusively for the royal family's personal hygiene use. Think about the layers of privilege embedded in that detail. Paper itself was a genuinely valuable, labor-intensive material for centuries after its invention, primarily reserved for writing, record-keeping, and official documents. The idea of using paper purely for personal hygiene, rather than for anything permanent or valuable, was, for a very long time, a luxury available essentially only to royalty and the extremely wealthy. Ordinary people across China, for centuries after paper's invention, continued relying on far cheaper, far more accessible materials, exactly like everyone else around the world at the time. It wasn't until paper production itself became dramatically cheaper and faster, many centuries later, that using paper for this purpose gradually trickled down from an imperial luxury into something an ordinary household could actually consider affording. Meanwhile, in Japan, an entirely different tool developed independently, smooth, flat wooden sticks called chugi, used to scrape clean before finishing with water. Archaeologists have actually recovered ancient wooden hygiene sticks remarkably well preserved in old wells and latrine pits, giving historians direct physical evidence of exactly how this method worked, rather than relying purely on written descriptions. Let's take one more detour before crossing the ocean, because ancient Egypt had its own quietly practical solution too. Along the Nile, soft river reeds were commonly gathered and used for personal hygiene, an abundant, renewable resource growing directly along the riverbanks that supported nearly every aspect of Egyptian daily life in the first place. And across the Atlantic, entirely unaware that any of these other civilizations even existed, indigenous peoples of the Americas were independently solving the exact same problem in their own ways. Aztec households commonly used dried corn husks kept near household privies. Maya communities relied on large, soft leaves gathered from the surrounding jungle canopy, and various plains and coastal tribes across North America used soft grasses, or in coastal regions, rinsed seaweed pulled directly from the tide. Once again, completely different continents, completely different centuries, zero contact between most of these cultures whatsoever, and yet the same fundamental instinct kept showing up again and again. Find whatever soft, absorbent material grows nearby, and put it to use. Let's cross the ocean now, because colonial and frontier America developed its own distinctly resourceful solution, one that genuinely surprises people every single time it comes up: the corn cob. Corn was everywhere on American farms, and once the kernels were removed, the leftover cob turned out to be a surprisingly practical, absorbent, reusable tool, one that could simply be tossed once used, with an essentially endless free supply available every single harvest season. Rural outhouses commonly kept a small basket of dried corn cobs hanging within easy reach, a detail confirmed repeatedly in diaries, letters, and first-hand accounts from the era. And then, as literacy spread and cheap printed material became widely available, an entirely new free resource appeared: old newspapers, and eventually, mail order catalogs. Farm families would tear out a page, use it, and move on, an approach so common that thick mail order catalogs specifically became associated with rural outhouses throughout the 18 and early 1900s, hanging from a string or a nail within easy reach. Here's a detail that's almost too perfect. Some of these catalog companies, once they realized just how commonly their thick, disposable catalogs were being used for exactly this purpose in outhouses across the country, actually started deliberately printing on slightly softer paper stock, a small, practical concession to an unofficial but wildly widespread secondary use for their product. Now let's talk about the wealthy, because throughout nearly every era we've covered so far, financial status quietly determined comfort in this particular department, just like it did in nearly every other aspect of daily life. Wool, soft linen, imported cloth, scented fabric strips. Wealthier households across many different eras and cultures consistently had access to noticeably softer, more comfortable materials than the general population, materials that simply weren't affordable or practical for most ordinary families to set aside purely for this purpose. Let's also take a quick detour to genuinely cold climates, because survival there demanded entirely different solutions. Arctic and subarctic communities commonly relied on soft moss, gathered even from beneath snow cover, along with soft fur scraps, and in a pinch, simply packed snow itself. Practical, locally available, and completely free, exactly the kind of resourceful solution that shows up again and again throughout this entire history, regardless of climate, culture, or era. Use whatever's actually available nearby, and make it work. Now, here's the turning point that changes everything. Because commercially produced toilet paper, specifically manufactured and sold for this exact purpose, is far, far newer than most people assume. In 1857, an American entrepreneur launched what's widely credited as the first commercially packaged toilet paper product, sold as individual flat sheets in a small box, and marketed, somewhat awkwardly, as a medicated product specifically designed to prevent hemorrhoids. Here's the part that genuinely surprises people. It was not an immediate hit. Free newspapers and catalogs were, after all, sitting right there in most households already, and convincing people to actually pay money for something they'd always gotten for free proved to be a genuinely difficult sell for several decades. The real breakthrough arrived roughly 3 decades later, when a company introduced toilet paper wound onto a roll, rather than sold as individual loose sheets, a format specifically designed to fit cleanly into a wall-mounted holder inside the newly popularizing flush toilet bathroom setup. But here's the twist nobody expects. Early rolled paper had a genuinely serious quality problem: splinters. Manufacturing processes weren't yet refined enough to reliably remove tiny wood fragments left over from the pulping process, meaning early customers occasionally experienced a genuinely painful surprise while using the product. Manufacturers spent years gradually refining their processes, and by the 1930s, one major brand proudly advertised itself, in a genuinely memorable piece of marketing, as splinter-free, treating basic softness as a groundbreaking innovation worth boasting about directly in national advertisements. Imagine a world where guaranteeing your product wouldn't physically injure the customer was considered a major competitive selling point. It's also worth mentioning just how closely this entire story connects to the broader history of indoor plumbing itself. Toilet paper on a roll only really made practical sense once the wall-mounted holder and the flush toilet it hung beside became a standard fixture in ordinary homes rather than a luxury reserved for the wealthy. Victorian-era plumbers spent decades gradually installing early flush systems, connected to newly built city sewer networks, as public health officials increasingly linked poor sanitation directly to the spread of serious disease. The soft roll of paper, in other words, didn't develop in isolation. It developed alongside an entire quiet revolution in how cities handled water, waste, and disease prevention, one that ultimately did more to extend average human lifespan than almost any single medical breakthrough of the era. From there, the format we recognize today came together quickly. Perforated tier lines arrived, letting customers cleanly separate individual sheets instead of tearing awkwardly along a rough edge. Multiple layers, or ply, got introduced, adding thickness and softness. Chemists developed specialized softening treatments for the wood pulp itself, and factories scaled up dramatically, transforming what had once been a genuinely awkward, hard-to-sell novelty item into a completely unremarkable household staple stocked in every single grocery store on the planet. And it's worth pausing here on just how enormous that industrial supply chain actually became. Modern toilet paper production relies on massive logging operations feeding wood pulp into paper mills, alongside a growing shift toward recycled paper and alternative fibers like bamboo, as environmental concerns about deforestation and water usage in paper production have become an increasingly significant part of the conversation. A product that started as smoothed over broken pottery and free newspaper scraps now represents a genuinely massive global industry, complete with its own supply chain vulnerabilities, as plenty of people suddenly discovered during a certain widely remembered shortage panic. When store shelves emptied out almost overnight, and a product nobody had thought twice about for decades suddenly became the single most talked about item in the entire country. Meanwhile, an entirely separate branch of this story had been developing quietly in France for centuries. The bidet, a dedicated water-based fixture built directly into the bathroom, emerged in French households as early as the 1700s, offering a genuinely different approach entirely. Instead of paper, a stream of water handled the cleaning directly. For a long stretch of history, the bidet largely remained a distinctly European fixture, while paper became the dominant standard across much of North America. That's shifted somewhat in recent years, with modern electronic bidet attachments and heated bidet seats, especially popular across much of East Asia, increasingly finding their way into bathrooms worldwide, essentially blending the ancient water-based tradition with genuinely modern engineering. It's worth pausing, too, on just how strange this entire product becomes the moment you leave ordinary gravity behind. Commercial airplanes stock remarkably thin, lightweight rolls specifically chosen to save weight across an entire fleet, a small but genuinely deliberate cost-saving detail most passengers never think twice about. And aboard the International Space Station, the entire concept had to be re-engineered almost from scratch, since ordinary paper simply doesn't behave the same way in zero gravity, requiring specialized hygiene systems, careful waste containment, and procedures astronauts train on specifically before ever leaving the ground. Even after thousands of years of refinement, it turns out gravity itself was quietly doing a lot of the work we'd always taken completely for granted. And then there's the shortage. Because for all the centuries of gradual refinement we've just walked through, splinters eliminated, layers added, perforations perfected, it took a single sudden wave of global panic buying to remind an entire generation just how quickly a completely unremarkable household staple can become the single most searched for, most argued over, most anxiously rationed item in the country. Empty shelves. Store-imposed purchase limits. Entire news segments dedicated to a product nobody had given a second thought to in decades. It was, in its own strange modern way, a small echo of exactly the same underlying anxiety people have apparently felt about this exact problem for thousands of years, dating all the way back to a shared sponge on a stick. So here's the real question worth sitting with. Every single method we've just walked through, a shared sponge on a stick in a Roman public latrine, smooth pottery fragments in ancient Greece, moss and leaves across medieval Europe, water poured from a simple jug across huge portions of the world for centuries, imperial paper reserved exclusively for Chinese royalty, wooden scraping sticks in Japan, a genuinely resourceful corn cob on the American frontier, a thick mail order catalog hanging from a nail in a rural outhouse, and finally, a splinter-riddled early paper roll slowly refined into the soft, unremarkable product sitting in your bathroom cabinet right now, represents literally thousands of years of humanity solving and repeatedly resolving the exact same universal problem, using nothing but whatever happened to be locally available and a genuinely impressive amount of trial and error. The roll sitting in your bathroom right now isn't really some obvious, inevitable invention at all. It's simply the latest, most convenient chapter in an extraordinarily long, genuinely fascinating, and occasionally genuinely uncomfortable human story. So the next time you reach for a fresh roll without even thinking twice about it, take one quick second to actually appreciate it. You're standing at the very end of an unbroken chain of human ingenuity, stretching all the way back to a sponge tied to a stick, sitting in a bucket of salt water, in a crowded Roman public latrine, thousands of years before anyone had ever imagined a soft, perforated, 3-ply roll. Let us know in the comments which ancient method genuinely surprised you the most. And subscribe, because next time, we're taking apart the history behind something completely different.